The dark history surrounding medieval torture devices is exceptionally frightening. However, when the torturous acts are explored more in depth, the underlying horror of the torture methods are exposed. The rack exemplifies the cruel nature that our ancient ancestors were capable of. Being able to explore the nature of the rack, as well as many other torture methods, can give us a better insight of how far we have come as a species. Our progression as a society is reliant on our memory. If we continue forgetting the mistakes of the past, only to keep repeating them, then we will never change. Humans will never advance forward, spiritually or morally, to become more than what we are. Facing the ugly side of human nature is the first step. This includes the barbarity of ancient torture devices, such as the rack. The rack was a form of torment that originated from the antiquity period, but was commonly used during medieval times. It is theorized that ancient Greece was one of the first civilizations to implement the rack as a torture device. They primarily used the torture against enslaved people and non-citizens. Outside of Greece, the rack was utilized with many other civilizations, such as in the Tower of London in the year 1420. The torture was primarily used against suspected traitors, heretics, and conspirators. However, anyone could fall victim to this devastating method of torture. Additionally, the rack could be used as a means of interrogation tactic to help extract information or confession from the victim. Like previous talked about torture devices, the rack could be manipulated by a designated torturer. The device itself was a wooden or iron bed-like open frame suspended above the ground. Attached to the frame were one or two rollers on opposite ends. The victim would be placed on the frame structure and would have their wrists and ankles chained to the rollers. As the interrogation progressed, a handle and cord mechanism attached to the top roller was used to gradually retract the chains. The roller could be rotated on its own axis, thus straining the ropes until the victim's joints were dislocated and eventually separated from the body. The device had different modifications depending on the country and culture it was used. For instance, in Russia, the victims were hanged by their chained hands. The suspension allowed for the individual to be stretched out while being whipped and having candles applied to different parts of their body. The French had an appetite for spikes, which they would apply underneath the victim's back. As the victims were put on the rack, the spikes dug into their back and further into their spinal cord, while their limbs were stretched out. This was no doubt excruciating to endure, taking the lives of countless people across many centuries. The rack is a sophisticated device in its design and can cause numerous physiological changes inside the human body. As the chains attached to your limbs begin to pull against each other, your muscles will start to stretch and tension will begin to build in your extremities. Your skeletal muscles will be tested the most during this initial process. Naturally, the extremities with more dense muscle fibers will hold up better against their counterparts. Your upper extremities will be the most vulnerable in this torture method, due to it being less muscular than the lower extremities. Skeletal muscle is made up of striated muscle tissue, in which the contractile fibrils in the cells are aligned in parallel bundles. As the muscles start to tear, you will begin feeling the initial effects of this device. Pain and soreness, as well as spasms and swelling, will start to occur in the affected areas. Following this, other areas are left vulnerable to the effects from the torture device. Muscle function and muscle balance help absorb the forces that impact the joints. With the victim's muscles being compromised, there is little left in terms of protection for many of these anatomical structures. The tendons that connect muscle to bone will suffer greater damages once muscles begin to tear. Tendons and ligaments are much stronger than muscle, but with the immense amount of stretching from the device, they would eventually be torn from the bones. The amount of internal bleeding, swelling, and inflammation that occurs following the destruction of muscles and tendons could lead to a condition known as compartment syndrome when given enough time to develop. Compartment syndrome is a painful and dangerous condition caused by pressure buildup from internal bleeding or swelling of tissues. If this pressure is high enough, the blood flow to the compartment will be blocked. This can lead to permanent injury to the muscle and nerves. If the pressure lasts long enough, the muscles may die, and the arm or leg will no longer work. With less advanced healthcare compared to today, fixing these damages caused by the rack were nearly impossible. If tissue destruction, infection, or disease affects a body part in a way that is life-threatening to the victim, then it would be essential to surgically remove the damaged body part. Failing to remove the severed extremity following traumatic injury will eventually lead to infection that can spread systematically throughout the body, ultimately leading to the victim's death. Early surgical intervention to remove damaged extremities typically had poor outcomes. Many resulted in death from shock caused by blood loss or the onset of infection and septicemia in those who survived the operation. Multiple damaged limbs as a result of time spent on the rack was almost surely a death sentence, even if the torture stopped midway through. If the torture didn't stop and instead continued on to stretch the victim even more, further damages would occur, eventually dislocating the limbs and ripping them from their sockets. This intense pressure would eventually result in the limbs being torn straight off the body. Such torture was known as being broken on the rack, racked, or stretched on the rack. Complications often occur when a body part is amputated. The most important of these are bleeding, shock, and infection. As much as 1 liter of blood may be lost before the arteries spasm and become vasoconstrictive. When blood vessels eventually constrict, blood flow is slowed or blocked. However, multiple limb amputations would lead to a substantial enough blood loss to kill an individual. If you lose too much blood, your brain doesn't get enough oxygen to support life. Losing an excessive amount of blood is known as hemorrhagic shock. Hemorrhagic shock is a condition of reduced tissue perfusion, resulting in the inadequate delivery of oxygen and nutrients that are necessary for cellular function. If you lose more than 40% of your blood, you will die. This is about 2,000 milliliters, or 0.53 gallons of blood in the average adult. Some form of bleeding, whether it be internal or external, is expected for the victims who were tortured with a rack. Damages done to the human body were catastrophic and often mortal. Let's just be glad that we get to learn about this notorious torture device rather than have to experience it firsthand.